She finally tells the story she has dodged for years, and you can see it in her shoulders before you hear it. Her breath deepens, the skin around her eyes softens, and the chest that always felt armored seems to loosen its straps. Something unclenches when the unsayable is said, and that is where our episode begins. Why can speaking change how a body feels, even when facts stay the same and the past cannot be edited? Why does a careful conversation make symptoms wobble, memories reshape, and choices expand where they were narrow yesterday? The origin myth of psychoanalysis starts with this question, and with a young woman history remembers as Anna O. In the late 19th century, physician Joseph Breuer listened as she described symptoms that made daily life frightening and strange. When she spoke freely about painful scenes, strange bodily troubles sometimes eased, a pattern she called the talking cure. Historians debate the details, the outcomes, and the myths that grew around them. But the seed they planted was undeniable. Words could move feelings and symptoms when medicine had little else to offer, and the room of talk became a laboratory for relief. Sigmund Freud, Breuer's colleague, and eventually his rebellious successor, set out to systematize that discovery. He organized methods that still shape therapy today: free association, interpretation, attention to transference, and attention to resistance. Free association meant letting the mind wander without censoring, like following a thread wherever it leads rather than tugging it into your planned path. Interpretation meant listening for patterns and meanings, offering possible connections that the speaker might not yet see. Transference meant noticing how feelings toward the therapist echoed older relationships, like a familiar song playing through new speakers. Resistance meant observing how we subtly avoid what hurts, through jokes, detours, silences, or sudden sleepiness that appears whenever we get close to the hot spot. None of these were magic tricks. They were disciplined ways to make inner life audible, nameable, and eventually manageable. To grasp the power of the talking cure, we'll move through 3 layers of how talk helps. First, making the implicit explicit, because naming what was unsayable changes its grip on the body and the mind. Second, working through, because revisiting patterns in a safe relationship turns single insights into lived options. Third, reauthoring the self, because story is the software of identity, and updating it shifts us from fate to responsibility. Start with making the implicit explicit, which sounds abstract until you watch it happen. A man says he is fine about a breakup, but every time his phone vibrates, his jaw tightens and his shoulders spike. He describes sleepless nights as annoying, then laughs too loudly and switches topics whenever tenderness enters the room. As he lets his words slow down, he names envy, fear, and a young belief that being needed is the same thing as being loved. The feelings were there all along, already steering choices, already shaping symptoms, yet they lived underground without language. When the feelings are spoken, they do not evaporate, but they become graspable enough to hold, examine, and soothe. A truth that can be named can be negotiated. A truth that cannot be spoken rules from the basement and has no seat at the table. This first layer is the move from fog to outline, from nameless pressure to a sentence you can repeat and refine. Now the second layer, working through, because one naming is not a cure, and one insight rarely rewires a life. Working through means meeting the same pattern again and again in a safe relationship, until new choices become possible without heroic effort. Think of it as physical therapy for feeling and relating, where repetition grows strength, balance, and flexibility in muscles you forgot you had. Transference is central here, not as a trick, but as the everyday fact that we carry old templates into new rooms. A client who learned to please an unpredictable parent may notice a tremor when the therapist pauses to think. In that microsecond, an old fear whispers that love has turned cold, and the client reaches for performance instead of honesty. When the moment is noticed together, the room becomes a practice ground where truth can be spoken without catastrophe. Over weeks and months, the nervous system learns from lived experience rather than pep talks, and the loop loosens its hold. A modern vignette shows how this looks in real life without fanfare or miracle language. A gifted project manager suffers panicky jolts every Sunday night, convinced that disaster awaits Monday morning. Inside the workday, they function superbly, yet their body carries an alarm that never shuts off. As they tell the story of a parent's sudden illness years ago, grief rises and finally finds air, named and held without rushing past it. The panic softens, not because tragedy is erased, but because it is now woven into a narrative that has room for sorrow and competence together. That is working through, the past kept in view, the present trusted more, and the body no longer forced to shout to be heard. Now the third layer, reauthoring the self, which sounds grand but often starts with a sentence. We are storytelling creatures, and the stories we repeat turn into expectations, roles, and permissions we forget we wrote. In analysis, the narrative shifts from, I am the person bad things happen to, toward, I am the person who can respond, repair, and choose. Reauthoring is not pretending the past was different. It is recognizing that the narrator has grown and can write new chapters. A person who spent years rescuing siblings may come to see that their identity was anchored in crisis, not in choice. As that story expands, the same person can invest rescue energy into building a life, a craft, a community where care is shared rather than hoarded. Insight alone does not change habits, yet insight plus practice plus relationship often does, because the story and the rehearsal move together. Let's pause for a historical object lesson. The couch that became a symbol of free speech for the mind. Freud placed the patient on a couch while he sat behind, not to be dramatic, but to reduce pressure to perform for his gaze. Without the constant feedback loop of facial expressions, some people found it easier to wander into memory and desire without bracing for approval. Others preferred face-to-face, and modern clinicians use both. But the couch reminds us that setting matters when you are trying to speak freely. The room is a tool, and the tool invites a particular kind of talk, the same way a library invites whispering and a kitchen invites sharing. When you hear about evidence, you might brace for numbers, but the headline is simple and heartening. Modern meta-analyses suggest that psychodynamic therapies can produce benefits that endure after treatment ends, especially on patterns that live deeper than surface habits. That does not crown one approach king, but it does support the intuition that talking carefully about meaning and relationship can be durable medicine. Now the counterpoints, because fairness honors viewers and the complexity of real lives. Therapy is not magic. It is work, and sometimes slow work, with long stretches that feel like weather rather than fireworks. It is time-intensive and quality varies, so a mismatch between person and approach can dull the effect. Not every problem requires deep excavation. Skills-based modalities help many people quickly, and good clinicians tailor methods to the moment. The best map is plural, flexible, and humble, because human minds come in more varieties than any school of thought can contain. Here are non-clinical practices you can adapt without turning your life into a treatment plan. First, try a weekly unsent letter, written to someone real or imagined, where you say what you have not been able to say. Address it to a person, a habit, a year of your life, or a younger self who still tugs your sleeve, and let the sentences be messy. You do not send the letter. You write it to learn what needs air, and you reread later to highlight phrases that carry heat. Second, practice a reflective pause when strong feelings surge toward helpers or leaders in your life. Ask whether the emotion echoes an older dynamic, and imagine 3 alternative explanations before acting, because transference loves speed and certainty. Third, do a values check that turns insight into micro-action, one step that honors who you want to be this week rather than who fear tells you to be. If you discover a pattern of people-pleasing, the micro-action might be a simple, honest no to a small request, delivered kindly and without apology. If you see avoidance in your calendar, the micro-action might be a single phone call made before noon, so the day can breathe. These practices are not prescriptions. They are invitations to air out the locked room gently, one window at a time. Common mistakes can derail good intentions, so let's name them with kindness. One mistake is seeking clever interpretations as if therapy were a riddle contest where the wittiest answer wins. Another is ignoring the relational context, as if insight could grow in a vacuum without trust, repair, and patience. A third is assuming that insight equals change, when in fact insight is a door you must walk through repeatedly until the hallway becomes familiar. To bring the ideas together, picture the mind as a locked room that has been closed for years. Inside are stories, tears, embarrassments, and moments of joy that never found words, and the air is heavy from being sealed. Conversation opens windows slowly, letting stale air exchange with fresh, and over time the room becomes livable, even beautiful. You do not bulldoze the house to get light. You open a window, then another, and the structure you already have starts to shine. The origin myth of Anna O reminds us that language and relationship can do surprising things when other tools fall short. Freud's system brought rituals to that surprise: free association, interpretation, transference, and resistance, turning flashes into a craft that could be taught and tested. Even with its limits and cultural blind spots, the talking cure endures because human beings are narrators who heal by telling and being heard. You might not need a couch or a clinic to taste a little of that power, though skilled help can be invaluable when pain runs deep. You might simply need a room, a notebook, a trustworthy friend, and the courage to let a sentence land fully without rushing to tidy it. Ask yourself what story you have avoided because speaking it felt like betrayal, weakness, or chaos. Ask who could hear that story with respect, and what one small act would honor it today without blowing up your life. It might be a message to a sibling, a quiet visit to a gravesite, or a changed boundary around a task that drains you dry. It might be a promise to tell a friend you are scared, or to tell yourself that the old version of you did the best they could. Often the body will tell you when you are close because breath returns, eyes moisten, and tension yields a fraction. When that happens, consider it a green light from your deeper self, inviting more air into rooms that deserve to be lived in. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Conversation is not a spell that fixes the past, but it is the fresh air that lets you live in your own house.